Chair, I think we're live.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, trustees. Before we start our meeting, I wrote something down. I'd just like to share it with you. I would like to acknowledge the tragic loss of one of our students on Monday evening due to a car accident. Sometimes there are no words of comfort at such a time, and the loss of a child seems like the world is somehow out of order. There were 6 other teens in the car, all injured, 2 in critical care. The mother of the student is also one of our teachers. So I think I can say on behalf of trustees and staff that our hearts, our thoughts, our prayers are with this family and the families of the injured teens. Thank you. We'll call this meeting to order. Okay, and I'm embarrassed to say that I did not bring the land acknowledgement with me. Do you have it? Would you like
me to begin with it, Trustee?
Yeah, that would be perfect. Thank you.
The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga people, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Okay, are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, we'll go on to the approval of the agenda. Trustee Barnes, thank you. Approval of the revised minutes from May 10th. Trustee Morton, thank you. Number 6, approval of the minutes from September 27th. Trustee Thatcher, thank you. We will move on tonight to the human rights policy. I'm going to call on Director Marsh. I think there's a short introduction to come. Thank you.
Thank you, through you, Chair Stone. Really happy to be here with trustees on behalf of the senior team who's also joined us to talk about the human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism draft policy before the Board of Trustees or the committee this evening. We recognize that this policy is a key one in terms of the responsibilities of the Durham District School Board, in terms of not only meeting our legal obligations expected under the Human Rights Code, but also the ethical responsibility to address systemic racism, oppression, and discrimination. The entire senior team is here this evening because we recognize that at the center of all of our work has been the priority of Indigenous rights and human rights informing it. And so given that it works across all interdisciplinary areas of the district, we're all here to provide support in terms of the committee and its examination of this draft policy. In terms of this evening, Council Cotter is going to provide some context in terms of introduction, and then we'll turn it over to Human Rights Advisor Mather, who has really led the work in terms of consultation, listening carefully to what we're hearing from communities, and creating this draft policy for your eventual approval. So I'll turn it over to Council Cotter at this time. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Just to provide a little bit of context, because I know some of the earlier materials that came to the board indicated that the policy would include safe and respectful workplace policy and procedure. After working through this issue with the director and the members of the Administrative Council, what we're proposing is that the safe and respectful workplace policy would fold into the workplace harassment policy. So we would come back to governance with a proposed amended workplace harassment policy that would include safe and respectful workplace. And there would be a procedure under that policy for employees to complain about workplace harassment or safe and respectful workplace or discrimination. So there would be a single pathway for employees to complain, and there wouldn't be any concern as to them following the wrong procedure. So we essentially have a single procedure for employees in that regard. The way we've thought about this policy is really the policy that's before you and the procedures that are before you. We've framed it really as the proactive piece around anti-discrimination and anti-racism, and those are the two the procedures you have before you are the sort of the main procedure under the policy and the framework. There are two additional procedures that are forthcoming that relate more to the retroactive piece in terms of complaints and accommodation. Of course, we already deal with complaints and accommodation issues, so we have protocols that we're doing, but we're envisioning that in light of this draft policy, we would have enhanced procedures as well. So those are two additional procedures that don't really impact the proactive piece. They're more the retroactive piece in terms of complaints and accommodations. That just set a little bit of the sort of the framework in terms of what's before you tonight. And I think I can turn it over to David Gamather.
Thank you, Director Marsh and Council Carter, for that introduction, and good evening, trustees. So my name again is David Gamather. I'm the Human Rights and Equity Advisor. And on behalf of Administrative Council, we're really excited to be here to bring forward the draft policy for you tonight. The policy package is a lengthy one, and it starts on page 9 of the agenda package. And there are a number of documents in it. I would like to spend a few minutes to quickly take you through what they are, how they were developed, and to provide a quick overview of them as well. First is today's board report on page 9, which outlines our approach to developing the policy. We've also included the board report from last fall. That's on page 13 for your reference. And that would really just outline the policy development and consultation process that we undertook, along with a presentation that was provided to trustees at that time. That presentation included a framework or an overview that starts on page 17 of the proposed key content and other considerations that would be included in the policy and procedure. And it also included a consultation plan that starts on page 38. And again, those are provided again today just for reference. And you may recall that the consultation process was meant to happen in two main phases. The first phase was to seek community input on the policy framework and on the consultation plan to see if we are missing any of the key components of the policy or on the consultation process itself. That first phase has been completed, and as part of that process, we met with all of the areas that are outlined in that proposal, and that was Student Senate, the Special Education Advisory Committee, Parent Involvement Committee, Equity and Diversity Committee. We met with the employee affinity groups, the employee association leads, and we also engaged students, employees, families, and communities through surveys, through thought exchange, through social media, and through other methods to invite feedback as well. And we also shared it with a few community groups and some critical friends to get some preliminary feedback. For phase 2 of the consultation, we plan to go back to all of those groups, committees, and communities to invite feedback on the actual draft policy to make sure that their input is appropriately reflected. And so on page 49 is a copy of the draft policy, and the draft is consistent with the development framework in terms of the main content, themes, and commitments. And in developing the policy, we considered and we incorporated feedback from the first phase of the community consultations. The policy is also informed by legal requirements under the code, under the Human Rights Code, and other legislation. And the policy also recognizes and respects the distinct rights of Indigenous peoples and works alongside the new Indigenous education policy and procedures. And it also aligns with policy guidance and resources from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Anti-Racism Directorate, the Ministry of Education. There are policies and procedure memoranda and related strategies and other materials. And in the policy, we include acknowledgements about the existence of systemic discrimination and racism in our learning and working environments and the negative impact that that has on students, families, employees, and communities. And the main objectives of the policy start at sections 2.1 to 2.4, starting on page 50. And those include some key things, among other things, are centering student voice, meaningfully engaging with communities, making decisions and acting in ways that uphold the rights of DVSB community members and that are not discriminatory, and really applying human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism principles and approaches, including intersectionality, including universal design for learning, inclusive design, and accessibility principles to all of the work that we do. And we're also really focusing, as Councillor Cotter mentioned earlier, on taking proactive and systemic approaches to addressing discrimination. And one of the other themes that will carry throughout the policy and the accompanying documents today is that we have individual and shared organizational roles and responsibilities to uphold human rights. The draft policy also outlines the Human Rights Code grounds, policy violations, and consequences for violations. And one of the main pieces of the policy is really framing around what we're calling duty-bearer responsibilities. And that is that we have legal and other duties and responsibilities to support students' right to education and employees' right to employment without discrimination. And the duty-bearer responsibilities are around promoting and protecting human rights, identifying, preventing, and addressing discrimination and discriminatory barriers in everything that we do, responding to human rights issues and accommodation requests and barriers as they arise, learning about human rights so that we can better understand how they apply to our day-to-day work, and then correcting issues and incidents of discrimination if and when they happen. And we explain what all of those mean with a focus on creating inclusive and accessible environments, affirming all identities, and making decisions that uphold human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism. We also include organizational responsibilities. So we have individual responsibilities as well as organizational ones to lay out our human rights expectations through things like policies and procedures, to build employee capacity around human rights, to uphold human rights by doing that proactive identification, prevention, and removal of discriminatory barriers in all aspects of our services, employment, our learning and working environments, really in everything that we do, and to establish effective accommodation, complaints, and issue resolution processes, and then to monitor, evaluate, and report on results through data collection, analysis, and public reporting. The policy also has attached to it a draft glossary of terms that starts on page 61. And these are terms that are used in the policy but might not be defined in policy. And that glossary is based on definitions provided in provincial resources from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Anti-Racism Directorate, from the Ministry, and from other sources. It's marked as draft and will be part of the consultation process too. So that is that we want to be able to consult with communities that are affected by discrimination so that their voices and perspectives on these definitions are heard as well. Page 70 is the draft main procedure on human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism, and it's really to support the operational implementation of the policy. The procedure takes those policy objectives and the duty-bearer responsibilities and lays out where and how they operate and how they apply in our learning and our working environments. And it also includes concrete actions and guidance to help identify, prevent, and address discrimination and racism in all of its forms. So, for example, that includes critically examining our own biases and our own processes and using tools and resources like Universal Design for Learning, CRRP, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, inclusive design, and accessibility principles in everything that we do. In the procedure, there is an emphasis on schools, on classrooms and teaching and learning, and other areas that directly affect students. But it also includes all of our other practices. So, for example, community partnerships, academic services, all corporate services departments, including IT, human resources, finance, and facilities, all system departments, as well as organizational responsibilities to apply and embed human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism in our system operational strategies and initiatives. And the procedure then also supports the policy by including requirements around data collection, analysis, and evaluation, along with reporting and communication so that we are transparent about the work we are doing and its impacts. And it also includes developing an evaluation plan so that we're measuring our effectiveness in meeting what we're setting out to do and that we communicate those results publicly. And finally, on page 85 is the draft rights, roles, responsibilities, and accountability framework that outlines those individual and organizational responsibilities that we mentioned earlier. It goes into greater detail and a lot of detail about what those are at both the individual and organizational levels, including those for the director, for designates, staff and managerial and supervisory roles, and all employees, to support everyone in understanding and upholding their human rights related responsibilities. And it also outlines actions that we take, again, at individual and organizational levels to fulfill those duty bearer responsibilities. And it also includes accountability mechanisms, and again, both at the individual level as well as the school or team or department, system and board levels, to demonstrate how we are meeting and upholding those responsibilities. So together, the draft policy, the procedure, the accountability framework, together they have a focus on the proactive and preventative actions and steps we need to take to uphold human rights and to fulfill our responsibilities, and to identify, prevent, and address all forms of discrimination, racism, and discriminatory barriers in our schools and in our workplaces. They outline all employees' responsibilities and what we need to do organizationally, and those can sometimes feed into each other and appropriately connect with each other in many ways. But the intent is to clarify what we need to do and what we might need to do differently to uphold human rights and to meet the objectives of the policy. And it's also about putting in place or enhancing our existing mechanisms to support an organizational culture of human rights that is accountable to our communities. And ultimately, the objective is to support and enhance equitable experiences, access, and opportunities, and to prevent discriminatory and disproportionate outcomes for all of our students, families, and employees. And all of that, we're hoping, will help to contribute to safe, welcoming, respectful, inclusive, accessible, and equitable learning and working environments that are free from discrimination, where all students and all employees feel safe, they have a sense of well-being, engagement, and belonging, and where they can all thrive. So that's a lot of content, and I know that was a really quick overview. We welcome any feedback, comments, or questions on the draft policy.
Thank you so much, Davika. Thank you for that presentation, and we will move to trustees with any comments or concerns over the policy. Michael Barrett, I think you had your name up or your hand up prior. Would you like to speak first?
Yeah, and I don't want to interrupt the flow that Davika has presented, because my question related all the way back to Patrick Cotter's comments, and I didn't get an opportunity to slip that question in. I do have some other comments, Davika, not comments or questions with regards to the policy, but I'm not sure if you really want me to go all the way back there, Chair Stone, or not. But what I'll do, maybe I'll save that clarifying question for Patrick to the end in order not to break the flow of this conversation. But I would like to come back to something Patrick had talked about earlier. So.
Okay. If I don't call on you, Michael, please remind me.
I won't let you forget. But I do, if there's nobody else has their hand up right now, Linda, I do have just a comment at this point. If I
Go
could.
ahead, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I appreciate this, and as you can well appreciate, this is a Herculean document, and I recognize that we're dealing with a Herculean task, and I was going to say issue, but an opportunity in front of us. I'm just wondering, though, as we go forward, if it doesn't hurt for us to be able to have the kind of Reader's Digest version of both the reasons for, maybe Davika, in the sense of what you're talking about, because what I'm concerned about is that the size of the both policy and procedure might preclude people from actually taking the time and giving its attention to what may be necessary. And maybe it's a 2-page manifesto, which would reference back to both policy and procedure. But I'm thinking this is such a high level, written at such an academic level that, and I don't mean that as a negative, Davika, I mean that in the sense of, who's our target audience, etc. Maybe it's a 2-page manifesto that then has links to the policy and procedure. I'm just looking at a way of being able to ensure that what we do is get as many people as we can to have feedback. And this might be daunting for some. I'm not saying that anything in it's not important. Please don't take it as that. But just wondering, how do we communicate it to the larger population? So,
if you're comfortable, Chair Stone, I'll begin and then turn it over to Human Rights Advisor Mather.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So, Trustee Barrett, really appreciate those comments, and we agree. In fact, I think Devika is really keen to get going on. We've talked about flow charts and visual representation. However, we didn't want to get ahead of trustees in terms of the approval of the policy and procedure, or approval of the policy. And so I think we'll be in a position where we're able to share those sorts of high level, exactly what you're talking about, a condensed version that's really accessible to families as well, but didn't want to get ahead too much in terms of polishing other products until we met this first threshold with you. But we're happy to work on that if that's of use to you before the approval process occurs. So I don't know, Devika, if you want to add anything to that, but certainly wanted to flag we didn't want to get ahead of trustees.
Thanks, Director Marsh. And yes, just to echo what Director Marsh said, yes, we are planning on, when we are ready to launch, to have a number of tools and resources to support families that are navigating the policy and procedures, including more digestible summaries of the content, very similar to what you were outlining, Trustee Barrett. So that's definitely in the works, but thank you for raising it.
just a quick supplementary, if I could, Chair Stone.
Go ahead.
Okay, I appreciate the responses, and certainly, Devika, I apologize for pronouncing your name incorrectly as well. So I apologize. But I think certainly, I know there's a lot of creativity with like even infograms, infographics that might also help us. So that will be an important thing, because I think the essential element is being able to make sure that as many people understand this on a go-forward basis. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Trustee Barrett. Trustee Barnes.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you. I'm very happy about this finally coming forward. I know it's been Devika's baby for a while, and I'm very thrilled about the robustness of the consultation, and that we're going to go back out and we're going to have community input again to make sure that we have captured all of the community concerns in regards to the policy. I support Michael's discussion around making it more accessible, more understandable. I would also say as we go forward in training that we talk about, I think competing human rights is going to be a big one. So I think we're going to have to invest some time and effort into understanding that each one is going to be on an individual assessment basis, but I think that is going to be a big conversation around this. But I do love the policy. I find it's very robust. I want to thank staff as well for adding in the socioeconomic piece in there around poverty. I think that is something that gets overlooked very often. On page 59, 3.2, I just wondered if we needed to add in partners in that section where we have when we talk about all the people that are held responsible under this policy. I think partnerships. I know we have service providers under there, but I know we do sometimes have partnerships with other organizations that it might make sense to add that in as well. So other than that, I think we're on a great start. Well, not start. I wouldn't say that, Devika, because you've owned this for a while. But I am very proud of the policy and look forward to seeing it operationalized.
Thank you, Trustee Barnes. Trustee Crawford. Trustee Crawford?
Yes, thank you. I was just looking for my notes. I spent many hours on this humongous document, and I agree with Trustee Barrett. This is far too large, and one of the reasons it's far too large is it's far too repetitive. I got tired of reading the same things over and over again. Plus, it does contain some things where we should almost go through this line by line and comment on it prior to it going to the public, or if you're planning on using this document during consultation, then maybe there's some things we should be saying about it. I'm a little concerned because human rights is not a new item, and we've been dealing with discrimination and other things at the board for several years now. So we must have policies and regulations in place right now.
Okay.
Are there significant changes to that?
Can you pick something for me?
I think Trustee Lundquist, I think you're, we can hear you. Sorry, Paul. Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Crawford.
No, I had just asked a question. I'd like to say more, but I had just asked a question about,
Okay.
don't we have policies in place? We've been dealing with this thing for a long time. And does this represent changes to those policies? Is that why there's a particular rush on it?
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. Devika, would you like to answer that? Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for the question, Trustee Crawford. We have had the Human Rights Code has been in place for a number of years. And as a district, as a board, we've had some policies and procedures that speak to equitable and inclusive education, workplace harassment. We've had some procedures and policies that support the code. But one of the reasons why we put forward the proposal to do this policy is recognizing that there were some gaps in those other ones, in that they didn't necessarily outline the specific steps, the specific duty bearer responsibilities that we're outlining in this policy to do the proactive prevention pieces, as well as policy or procedure guidance around accommodation and addressing complaints. So that's one of the reasons why we brought this forward last year, was recognizing that we did have some policies in place, but there were some gaps that we needed to address.
Well, I guess that's part of our job to address those, and I'm trusting that the trustees have read through this and do have some comments and suggestions. And it's not just going to be 2 or 3 of us commenting on this.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford.
So I don't mind. I'm going to back off for a few minutes and let some other people make some suggestions and comments, but I would like to come back later.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Crawford. Trustee Barrett.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll certainly, Linda, yield any point that anybody else wants to speak. So, but if there's silence, I may fill it. So be wary. So just I'll make a couple of comments and then shut up and then move on and then maybe come back again. Just in relationship to, and I know that, of course, I took particular interest in the role of trustees within this piece. A question I would have, and it's maybe can't be answered, just in relationship to the code of conduct that we have, our code of conduct policy. This is quite an expansive policy that almost challenges the Education Act in the sense of the roles and responsibilities of a school board. The umbrella is quite large. And I mean, I quite understand with the human rights piece that it is as much as an umbrella. And we've got a couple of umbrellas that we're dealing with in the sense of the Education Act, the human rights, which almost spells out very specifically what the role of trustees are in relationship to policy, procedure, etc. but I have been around long enough and have seen pieces in the other board that there are elements that have occurred with discrimination, comments, practices, etc., that need to somehow be linked back to the code of conduct. Because, and I know OPSP is looking at the code of conduct, the province is asking for input, but I just wanted to make that comment that there are some elements in here in the sense of the role and responsibility that also need to dovetail, I think, with the rewriting of the code of conduct, because our code of conduct doesn't necessarily include or is inclusive of many of the elements that are being outlined as roles and responsibilities of trustees. And certainly the code of conduct, I think, should reflect that. I recognize this isn't a policy yet, but I'm just looking into my crystal ball saying that may have to be looked at again as well. So, and just the last comment, just to that, the whole piece of the umbrella, this has very significant ramifications on the role of a trustee at the board, because now everything's going to be placed upon within the framework of human rights and anti-discrimination and anti-racism, etc. And it changes quite dramatically, I think, the relationship between staff and trustee. And I think that there needs to be an understanding that potentially could change that role and etc. Because there are many elements within here that I'm not saying that they're in contravention of the Education Act. What it really does, I think, is it takes it even further in the sense of the budgeting process, everything you do, it has to have that lens. So I think as trustees, we have to be very well aware that I think it dramatically changes the role, responsibility, and accountability of trustees. Not arguing that it's not right. I'm just saying that it is far reaching, and then we need to make sure we comprehend that. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Barrett. And I think this ties into your comments. I think I do remember reading in this policy that this policy takes precedence over our bylaws and code of conduct. Is that correct, Director Marsh?
I'm happy to jump in, Chair Stone, if that's okay. So I guess a couple of key points. The policy confirms, I guess, the trustees, individual trustees are not duty bearers in the policy, which I think is the key, one of the key obligations on all employees of the board. So, but to Michael's point, there is some specific, Trustee Barrett's point rather, there is some specific comments on the role of trustees around policy and strategic planning. So I take his comments are fair comments. The point about the primacy of the policy, Trustee Stone, is that this policy would inform the interpretation of all other policies. And if there's a conflict with another policy, this would govern. The corporate bylaws are not policy, so we could clarify that, but this would not trump the provision of a bylaw that governs the internal affairs of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cotter. Trustee Lundquist.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I have to say that I have some agreement with Trustee Crawford in the sense that I think it needs a good edit, that there are repetitive provisions within the document. But that being said, I wasn't frustrated, bored, or angry with any of them, because I think that we're talking about imposing, it's not the right word, about choosing a policy that actually reflects what obligations we already have. And so I hear some of the points that Trustee Barrett has made, and I don't disagree with them either. But I think one of the things that we sometimes lose sight of is that human rights law is quasi-constitutional in nature. It means it has more status than any other law. And so, the policy, in my view, doesn't do much more than reflect the status of that law. So, I mean, it does it in a much more detailed way, but the approach actually, in my view, reflects what is already happening, or should be happening on a widespread basis across the province. And so, although I do think that some simplification and some editing are necessary, I'm actually really impressed at the work that has gone into the document and into the thoughts surrounding it. I am delighted to see us actually be slightly more expansive by referencing socioeconomic status. Class is an unfortunate way of referring to it sometimes, but to me, that's one of the things that we lose sight of very frequently. And I just want to make it clear that although I am firmly in support of this policy and the reach into all of us behaving in a way that supports human rights, because I think that is a legal obligation that we already have in terms of being a service provider of education, I also think that it goes a little bit further in a way that I'm very supportive of, because law really is still the bare minimum. And I don't think anyone should expect the bare minimum from us. So I just want to say thank you for all of the tremendous work. I recognize there's still some work ahead, but I'm very impressed with what I see and the commitment of the board to really give primacy to something that makes a tangible difference to people's dignity and self-respect. So I have nothing more that I'm going to say at this stage other than to say thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. Trustee Edwards.
I was just going to, some of my points have already, Trustee Barnes made a few of the comments that I would have, and some of what Trustee Lundquist as well as Trustee Barrett have said are some of the similar thoughts I've had. Just a quick note on item, I think it's 2.4. I would really like to see anti-ableism added there. And then the follow-up on Trustee Barrett's comment around it's the procedure part around trustee responsibilities. I think that I'm having a problem between the Education Act and stuff and ensuring that they marry and where the responsibilities are. And so I didn't have time to actually go through and actually look at possible wording from it, but I think there needs to be a little bit work there on the trustees' responsibilities so that it's very clear as far as what the expectations are under the Education Act, and to ensure that we meet also the Human Rights Code and this policy.
Thank you, Trustee Edwards. Trustee Forbes.
Thank you. I too have, and I do appreciate that this is a very comprehensive document, and I'm quite impressed by the by the thoughtfulness that has gone into this and the accountability piece, which I know is always. We can have the best policies in the world, but if we're not holding people accountable for adhering to them, then they really are quite meaningless. So I'm quite happy to see the various levels of accountability woven throughout the document. So I just wanted to make note of that.
Thank you, Trustee Forbes. Are there any other comments? I have comments myself, but I would like to have the other trustees go first before I have quite a few, possibly amendments, but so are there any other trustees? Paul, I don't know if you wanted to speak now or if you'd like to go after I speak.
No, I'll wait until everyone has spoken. I'm still researching the document, so when you're ready for me, give me a heads up.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Crawford, are there any other comments from trustees? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to go ahead with mine then. I've got some comments, some suggestions. On page 46, I know this is part of the, I don't know what appendix number it is, but back in the DDSB community consultations, you've got the Keenan, now you've got a list of them, but I just wondered whether or not you considered also speaking with the Jewish community, Christian community, Chinese, Asians, Southeast Asians. There's other people who were left out of the consultation list there, and just wondered whether or not you would have considered that. That's one thing. Page 46, I don't know if anybody considered consulting the elderly. We have ageism on there. I don't know if anybody spoke with the elderly on this. I think they should be included. Page 50. Page 50 made me really sad. Talks about really how bad our education system has been, and this includes the DDSB. Made me quite upset to see how poorly this board has done. Unless I'm misunderstanding this, we have obviously left out a lot of people who have been stereotyped, who've been hurt, who've been affected by everything that's been in this policy. So we at one point were saying how wonderful our education system is in Canada, and I see this. Doesn't make me very proud of this board or of the education system when we can see that we are a part of what's happened to these people who've the LGBTQ community. So I was surprised at page 50. I just, anyway, we've got the policy and it's going to improve things, which is fantastic. And it's an amazing document. So I will move on to page 51. So page 51, it's got intentionally address anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Latin American racism, all other forms of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hate. And then you have anti-Semitism, which could you please add or think about adding anti-Jewish hate, anti-Jew hate to that. If you're going to add that to Islamophobia, it needs to be added to anti-Semitism as well. And if anybody thinks that it shouldn't be added, I just want to give you a quote from the Ontario Human Rights Commissions, which states from 2020, they just had a conference, crimes against Jewish people accounted for the highest number of religion-based hate crimes in Canada. Page 54.
Just a quick question, and forgive me, Trustee Stone, I just wanted clarification. Is anti-Semitism, is that not address the anti-Jewish aspect? Or I'm just for my own understanding, sorry.
I didn't write the policy, so I'm not going to answer that. So maybe
just anti-Semitism.
Devika, could you answer that, please?
Sure, thank you. And in the glossary, we are defining what Islamophobia is and what anti-Semitism is. And the definition of anti-Semitism does include hate directed towards people who identify as Jewish. And so that's why it wasn't named in the way, Trustee Stone, that you had suggested, because it's covered off in the definition.
Okay.
However, we're open to community feedback on that.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Trustee Forbes. Good question. Page 54. So page 54 addresses sorry, just bear with me. 3.17. So I'm worried about some of the you have down here D, hate activity, including hate speech. I'm concerned a little bit about what can be subjective, and the fact that intent does not matter. So, and I think this may have come back to one of the trustees who's I think it might have been Trustee Barnes who talked about maybe competing rights, but it does concern me when intent doesn't matter, and that things can be very subjective and maybe seen as an oppressive thing or a microaggression or what have you, and not intended to be in any way, shape, or form. So that was just something to point out. Could you remind me too of where the definitions came from, Devika?
Sure. Most of them came either from documents that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has put out, the Anti-Racism Directorate, from the Ministry of Education's the Equity and Inclusion Strategy, as well as other resources and documents. For some, I needed to dig a little deeper to find some definitions, and so I've cited the sources in the glossary.
Thank you so much. Page 65, you've got under Islamophobia, it's got includes racism again, and I'm just wondering, because Islam is a religion and there are Muslims from all races, I just wondered why it says includes racism.
Happy to try to answer that. One of the things that the code and the policy recognizes is that for some grounds, including religion, in some cases it can be linked to race, and so it's considered a race-related ground, and so that's why it's framed that way in the glossary. And if we are looking at an instance of Islamophobia, we would look at the particulars around that situation to determine what grounds are involved and how to address it.
Thank you. Thank you. And page 65, Caitlin's principle. I hadn't heard about that before. Just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. It was really interesting. I looked it up. But I also wondered about parents' agency over their child. Like, does that conflict at all? I know there have been incidents of children who have come home and said that they feel that they are trans. And this is tough on the parents, obviously. And I just wondered if that had anything to do with something like that, because of course we're going to respect the child's wishes and their thoughts and their bodies, but I just wondered about, is there a conflict with the agency of the parents over the child?
I'm happy to start to answer, and perhaps Council Cotter can jump in on where we're at with Caitlin's principle as well. And so Caitlin's principle is really, it aligns with some of the United Nations instruments around upholding and centering the rights of the child, acting in their best interest and centering the child's identity in decisions that affect them. And then I'll turn it over to Council Cotter in terms of where that lands in Ontario.
So we don't see as much reference to it anymore because the key principles have been now incorporated into legislation in Ontario in the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, where we see the child at the center of that legislation. So it's referenced here just because I think some people in Devika's world still reference it, but in the education world, but it's really now incorporated into legislation. On the second piece, that's a complex question, of course. Our mission, in accordance with the policy, written or unwritten, of course, is to respect the child and to act in the child's best interest. And what we're really, a lot of these issues come down, of course, to the child's own agency and ability to understand consequences of decision making.
Thank you, Council Cotter. Trustee Forbes.
Thank you, Chair Stone. I just had a question about that, is that in terms of to whom this policy applies, I mean, I'm assuming that it wouldn't extend out to parents, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but this is more to do with and just so I'm understanding, like this is for the DDSB. You know, we've seen the trustees reference, but we're really talking about people within the organization adhering to this policy. Is that correct? Just for my own understanding.
Happy to answer that. Yes, when we're talking about the application of the policy, it applies to all DDSB community members. That does include parents in the sense of if there's a parent that, for instance, requires an accommodation to attend a meeting, it would apply to that. But as Council Cotter said, when it comes to the rights of the child, those are centered in our conversations around upholding those rights.
Excellent. Thank you.
Supplementary, did you want to have something else to say, Trustee Forbes?
Oh, no, well, I was just wondering, and this is just a bit of a thought that's come to me, and in terms of accessibility of our meetings, and I just wanted to make sure that somewhere in here, in terms of making sure that all of our public meetings are fully accessible, in terms of closed captioning and being, I know Trustee Edwards has talked about ADO compliance, not just for our meetings, but also all of our resources and on our websites. And I know it's a huge job, but I know that's really central to many of the aspects of this policy. And I know that's kind of operational, but I'm hoping that that's a direction that we're also moving in.
I'm happy to speak to parts of that too, if I may. Some of that is covered off in the additional procedure that Council Cotter referenced at the beginning around inclusive design and accommodation. And I know that there's also a ton of work happening in our communications department to make sure that our websites and our meetings and our events are inclusive and accessible.
Thank you. So I'm going to go on with my last request, which is on page 68. And this may be a hot button request, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I've written some things down. So the term is white supremacy. And I'm concerned about it because I'm worried about our staff, our students, our parents, and how this term will be taken. This term separates whites from anyone else. This term is derogatory, even though it is explained that it's not derogatory. People take it as derogatory, believe me. So I was interested to see that you actually had to put a quote in there stating that you are not saying that people are good or bad. Just the fact that you had to put that definition in shows that there is concern. I'm really worried that this is going to hurt and offend people. And in my little anecdotal world, it does. So I wondered if it could be removed so as not to criticize people, so as not to make people feel small or as if they've done something wrong because of the color of their skin. I'm sure we do not want to create any negative before we start with this policy. So I'm going to ask if this term can be changed, if you can use different wording, and I'd like it removed from all the wording in the policy.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Stone. Certainly, we recognize the role of education and the importance of providing definitions so that we're all able to work forward in a progressive and proactive way in terms of ensuring that our systems that are in place do change. In terms of a specific request like that, I imagine that would be something that the trustees would need to discuss and pass a motion on in terms of where it lands for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Trustee Crawford, would you like to speak?
Yes, I've got a few comments, but first I'd like to build on that one because that was my main concern. I don't want to be critical of the document because so much work has gone into it, and I think everyone's doing a good thing by putting out as much as they have. But from this, we need to step back and reduce the size of it, and also we need to look at it almost line by line. And that particular one there, white supremacy, it only means one thing. It's purely negative. It's insulting to white people. In fact, it's insulting to anyone. If it's just there for the purpose of producing conversation, maybe I would say, nice try, but don't do it. If you had spoken to a public relations person, they would have said, get that out of there. If you're trying to sell this, and this is what you've actually been working on, then don't put that in there. It only means one thing. It's insulting. It's almost a form of, we want to stop racism, so let's reverse the racism on the white community. So I feel very strongly about that. I would never support any document, no matter how good it is, with that wording in there. And now if I can go on to, I did find my highlighted document, and if I may, I'd like to just put these out, Madam Chair, as thoughts and see what we can do with them. And it's similar to what you did. By the way, I noticed that we use PDF, and PDF you can't do much with editing. I have to convert all my stuff to Word where I can work on it or even have it read to me. Okay, so here's some of the things I highlighted. We have to pay a great deal of attention to undue hardship. That's part of the Act. And we have to pay a great deal of attention to safety. And I know people are saying, here goes Crawford again, harping on safety. Well, safety is paramount. No matter what we do, I know we've argued about this in violence and safety in the classroom, and we have to think about it here too. When we're trying to appease people or when we're trying to point out things that are wrong, we have to be careful about what the costs are going to be and how it affects safety. I've already spoken on white supremacy. It's got no business in here. One of the other things I did notice is that it speaks of director and designates. And I know we always say that, but I'm thinking on an important subject like this, I'm hoping we're thinking of director and designates as being a team of people. It's never a good idea for one or two people to have a great deal of authority or influence over a group. So I'm hoping that you've set up a team of people, and some of those people would be maybe arguing some of the points in here to make an even better document. There's an article in on classroom management and discipline. Well, there's a very important article right within the Education Act on that speaks about safety. And as I've mentioned before, when we're putting together our policies, we need to be careful that we don't supersede some good policies that are already in place, especially if they happen to be laws. And when we refer to the Act, the human, I have it right here, the Human Rights Act. It's been out since 1981, so there's nothing new about it. And we should have a link to it, because quite frankly, that document is much clearer than our document. It talks about equality, treating people the same, treating all people the same. That's what the whole thing is built on. And then it goes into specifics. Another thing I would have liked to have seen is some examples as to why we're putting out the effort on this. What's been going on in our system that requires us to pay that much attention to this? And I know it says here later that staff is going to report these incidents to the board. I'd like to see that strengthened by saying it's going to be reported quarterly or monthly or even as they occur. I'm a little taken back by we're obviously not expelling students anymore, which tells me that then there isn't any of the things taking place in the act. None of the children are doing any of those things anymore because we're not expelling people anymore. Not that I'm in favor of expelling, but it just kind of makes people wonder why no more expulsions. No right is absolute. Director, you put out a couple of comments prior to this, and one of the things that was mentioned in there is about no rights are absolute. Well, the right to be safe is absolute. There might only be one of them, but there is a right to be safe. And the other document that's attached, I don't know if we're going to deal with it tonight, but I wouldn't mind going to it after this one and speaking to some of those questions that were raised on it, especially this one.
Sorry, Trustee Crawford, could you repeat the last little bit?
Well, there's another document attached, I think, where there was a presentation, and in that presentation it was about no rights are absolute, and also they had asked people to speak about how do you feel if there's danger within a classroom. Is that not an attachment as well? Was that not a presentation at another time that we spoke to?
I don't recall, Trustee Crawford. Director Marsh, do you recall that?
Thank you. The board undertook some PD with a human rights lawyer in terms of the Ontario Human Rights Code in preparation for the work of the human rights policy. And so that presentation was shared with trustees just as a reminder of that PD evening that was held in April.
I just thought it would be an interesting point to argue. For one of the things that jumped out at me is 334.
Do you have the page, Trustee Crawford?
It's on 88 on my pages. It's only one example, but it's something, when we put out documents like this, and we know that we've had a great deal of trouble over the years with busing, and we have to have a strict policy on busing so it doesn't get out of hand. But this particular item under E, accessible and inclusive student transportation services, I can just see someone seeing that and coming back on us saying, you really don't have a right to exclude anybody from busing. Small example, but just it shows you how this document needs to be edited. Working environment for all employees. Safe. and equitable. And maybe
Thank you,
the director, I'm saying how.
Oh, sorry, I
safety
thought
is
you were
so
finished.
important.
Sorry, Trustee Crawford. Keep going. Go ahead.
Oh.
Did you have a question for Director Marsh?
Well, I did. I was going to ask about the director and designate. Is that a team? Because our documents before have always said the director, and we know we only have one employee, and that's the director. I've always thought that there's a great deal of power and authority given to the director. And now we use director or designates, which means that some people are designated as an associate directors. But I'm hoping in this document it means that a team has been set up, even if it's a full team. So what is meant by director and designates?
Director Marsh?
Thank you, through you, Chair Stone. And Council Cotter, feel free to jump in from the legal perspective in terms of the work. It's most commonly identified when it is identifying responsibilities. And you're right, the board does only have one employee, but that's not to say that policies wouldn't apply then in terms of responsibilities for a broader sense of it. So in terms of using the terminology and designate, it is reflective of the idea that this policy and the implementation of this policy and corresponding procedures doesn't sit just with the Director of Education. And so in operationalizing the work, I would then be asking in terms of specific individuals to come forward in terms of ensuring, and the accountability framework, ensuring that we are accountable to our public and to our community in terms of the policies and procedures and their implementation. They are comprehensive, they're complex, and it does require a multidisciplinary team in order to breathe life into this policy and the corresponding procedures. Councillor Cotter, I'm not sure if you want to add to that. Sorry.
I think it clarifies it, and that's what I wanted to hear. Is there anything else on that? Okay, on 346B, raise awareness among employees about the human rights related roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities, and that human rights violations have consequences. I wouldn't mind knowing, and probably some of the public wouldn't mind knowing, what those consequences might be. Because quite often we don't list what the consequences are, even though we might say that bullying won't be tolerated or violence won't be tolerated. Sometimes people are not sure about what the consequences are, or if there is any.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. Who would like to take that? Okay, sorry, go ahead, Devika.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. Happy to try to clarify. At section 3.20 of the policy, so that's on page 54 in my package, it does talk about what the corrective and remedial response to policy violations can be, and it can range, and what the range of it can be up to and including termination of employment. And again, it's spelling out there what the potential consequences can be.
I think if I can jump in, Chair Stone, I think what the draft tries to accomplish is to have the board lay out sort of the general policy parameters in 3.2 of consequences, recognizing that a lot of consequences are operational and are case specific, but we tried to have the policy at least speak to the general policy parameters around it being largely remedial and corrective, but recognizing there obviously can be cases where there could be discipline up to and including termination.
Okay, thank you. And on page 96C, I think I mentioned this, but providing regular reports to the Board of Trustees about organizational compliance with the human rights policy, including relevant implementation and experience. I hope that means that we'll be keeping track of examples of where something needed to happen, or events that are happening. When we asked about these before, they seemed to be numerous, but we didn't know what they were. And so trustees aren't involved with expulsions anymore because there are no expulsions. So we don't sometimes get a very good picture of just what's taking place in the actual situation. And I'm just going to mention this, and then I'm not going to talk anymore because even I'm tired of hearing me. Although not within the definition of a duty bearer, and I think Trustee Barrett brought this up, that interests me. A duty bearer, we have responsibilities to, and we certainly have responsibilities to safety and to all of the students and staff. So this new term, duty bearer, what does it mean to the trustees?
I'm happy to jump in, Trustee Stone. So the duty bearer is a defined term under the policy. It has no, it doesn't flow from the Education Act. It's a term that's unique to the human rights policy. And it sort of confirms the individual responsibility within the organization to implement and to follow the policy. So what we tried to do there was just to make it clear that trustees are not, they're not in the field, they're not operational actors of the board, so they can't be held to those duty bearer responsibilities in terms of responding and correcting individual behavior. So it's really, we tried to speak to it at the policy level, and I hear trustees have some concerns about how we did that, but that's the rationale in terms of what we tried to do in terms of not making trustee duty bearers and trying to focus on the policy function.
Thank you, Council Cotter. Trustee Crawford, I'm going to move to Trustee Forbes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just had a question circling back to the concerns with white supremacy being laid out in the document. And I just would like some more information on that. I mean, I identify as white, and I recognize that, my social location is different, and it's privileged often in many publicly funded institutions, be it education, be it health care. And I think that the definition, it made a lot of sense to me, and I'm not offended. I think that, my lived experience is very different. So I just would like to understand a little more, and I wasn't offended. I think it's a real white privilege and white supremacy is really woven through not almost all of our public institutions, and that's why we're doing this, is to make sure we're honoring those human rights. And that doesn't discount white human rights, but I think it's really important that we be very clear in the language in our policies, so there's no ambiguity about what things mean and the standards that we expect all people who interact with students and other staff members, that we are incredibly clear. So I would just like to hear a little more on that, because I personally, as a person who identifies as white, is not offended by the term, but I'm hearing that others might be. So I would just be interested in learning more.
Thank you, Trustee Forbes. I'm just going to move to Trustee Barnes.
Thank you. I was going to ask in regards to community consultation and the consultations that we've done so far. What was the feedback in regards to the word white supremacy? I mean, you've gone out into the community and you had those conversations. I'd be interested in hearing what were some of the things around that particular phrase. In regard to Trustee Crawford, when we're talking about incidents, we're talking things that have happened systemically, that have been long-term, that have been identified for years, that we're starting to identify and address in regards to certain students of their racialized population, or LGBTQ population, or Indigenous population. So I understand the want in those incidents to come forward as a report, but I think that report would be very, very, very huge. And I don't know, and we do get a list of human rights or complaints that are against the board. So I don't know, we have seen some, but we have, this policy is addressing a systemic type situation, a disadvantage that a number of our students have experienced, as well as staff. So I just wondered if you, any feedback in regards to that, the consultation around that word, Davika?
Sure, happy to address that, Trustee Barnes. So when we did the consultations, it wasn't on the draft policy as you see it now, it was on the framework, but we did get, as part of the consultation process, feedback around including the word. And so just want to remind the trustees, one of the policy principles or the objectives of the policy is that notion about nothing about us without us. And racialized communities that are directly affected by systemic racism, they're commonly using this terminology. And as others have said, not only specifically in education, but also across many other sectors. And we recognize the importance of explaining what we mean when we say that, when we use that phrase, so that we have a common understanding. So that's why we did include a definition of it in the glossary about what it is and what it isn't, so that we are consistent in that. We also understand the various reactions to the terms because of the connotations around it, but based on the definition, we know that it's related to structural racism and structural norms. And by using the term in this context, it helps us to raise awareness and prompt some of those important discussions that we need to have. And it's important that we reflect what we are hearing from communities that are impacted by racism. And we have a responsibility to not only acknowledge it and name it, but then to act on it as well. And then to truly act and address racism, we have to have an understanding of and then reflect on how racism is upheld and how it operates. And again, we need to name it. And one of the things that we're hearing is that language is powerful and can help to propel us to reflect and to act. Communities are calling on us to not take a neutral position and instead to be actively anti-racist in our approaches to addressing racism in our learning and working environments. And that's what we're trying to do through the policy and the related materials, and by including that phrase.
Follow-up, Trustee Stone? And so we have now written the policy, and we're going to take that back out to our community. And through another consultational period. So, and that will come back to us as to the feedback in regards to that policy. So I guess this would be one of the things that would probably flag in regards to the concerns for trustees around that particular word, and see what comes back from our community and consultations. Because I recognize that this is a standard phrase that is acceptable in our human rights piece and in doing the human rights work. So it'll be interesting to see what comes back after the policy is written. Yeah, that's it. My thought process is kind of going, but thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Trustee Forbes. Are there any other comments? Trustee Barnes. Trustee Forbes, were you still looking for answers, and did you want conversation around that, or?
You know what, Thank you, Chair Stone. I feel like that was a really good and answer, and I really appreciate Trustee Barnes hitting on the community consultation and what Devika had said. And I apologize if I just said your name incorrectly. But yes, not about us without us. That is so vital. That and it is really going back to the community and get their all aspects of our communities across Durham. I think is incredibly important and powerful, and I believe it shows a commitment to meaningful consultations. So really look forward to what's going to happen next. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Forbes, for your comments. I would just like to say with the phrase white supremacy and what you may hear back from your consultations is that I think people are afraid to broach it. I think you may not hear what some people are really thinking because they're afraid to speak about it. They're not going to tell you all the time what they're actually thinking, and they might find it a hurtful phrase, but you may not hear that from them. So I hope that people are brave enough to speak up, because I think it's vital for you to hear exactly what people, and maybe they won't, I don't know, but I just know from, again, my few anecdotal people that I speak with and what I've heard is that it is hurtful to people. And people are afraid to speak up because they are afraid to be called names. They're afraid to be called racist if they say anything about it. I think that's shameful. They should be able to speak their truth and what they're thinking as well as anybody else. So I hope that people are open and honest with you, and I do look forward to the comments to come as well. Thank you. Trustee Barnes.
Sorry, and I'm not taking anything away from the conversation you're having as Trustee Stone, but I think when we talk about things that are hurtful and things that are making big impacts, these are communities that have dealt with that sort of hurt and have dealt with this side of pain for a very long time. So I understand communities now that have not had to deal with that may feel somewhat targeted, but these are communities that have not had a voice for a very long time. And so as we go through this journey to make things better and more equitable for everybody, it will be a process that is not always going to be easy, and it's not always going to be painless. So I just want to put that on there.
Thank you, Trustee Barnes. I 100% agree with you completely. And my only fear is that also with the terminology, if it gets people's backs up, you want people on board with this policy. You want buy-in with this policy. So if people are turned off, and if it's something that we can just eliminate from the policy because it may have that reaction, I think that it would be worth looking into. But we want 100% buy-in with this. It's an incredible policy. So we don't want people hurt. I agree with you, Trustee Barnes. So if we can look at it, maybe not, but I want buy-in, right? So if backs are up right away, they don't bother reading through the rest of it, so. Trustee Forbes.
Sorry, just quickly, but I don't want us to presuppose what the community feedback is going to be. So I think we've kind of, I think it's important that we just be open to receiving those comments. But I do appreciate what you're saying totally, Chair Stone. So thank you.
Thank you. And Trustee Crawford, and I'm just going to say if there are no other comments after Trustee Crawford, we're going to move on from the policy and move into the bylaws. Okay, Trustee Crawford and then Trustee Barrett.
Okay, just one other suggestion is because we're educators, phobia has a specific meaning. It means extreme or sickness. So that's another thing that we should try to avoid. I know we use it at three different times, but we would be better to stay with the anti, as in anti-Semitism, anti-trans, anti-Islam. Stay away from the phobia idea.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. Trustee Barrett.
Yes, I was going to go all the way back to Patrick Cotter now. So yeah, I didn't forget about you, Council Cotter. So, but just one quick comment, and I'm going to ask the question. I mean, this is certainly this is the time of uncomfortableness for sure, and I think there's many things that are going to go forward that we're all going to be very, very uncomfortable with on communities that have been long discriminated against, communities now that are just blossoming as communities for the first time. There's going to be a lot of uncomfortableness with a lot of parties, but recognizing, and I know we all do, recognizing where we want to be able to be in the sense of ensuring that the equity is for all, not just for the chosen few. I'll move on from that and then go back to you, Patrick Cotter. So at the beginning, you had spoken about with regards to the, an employee policy, the anti-harassment and stuff. And I will admit that when I was reading this policy, recognizing that was missing from that. So I appreciate the comments. I do recognize also that when we're looking at harassment policies, et cetera, that are primarily workplace related, it is really the purview of staff, in the sense the policy for staff. However, I have seen boards use that harassment policy against trustees, which I might say is totally illegal. But however, boards have utilized that to muzzle trustees. So I think it is important that we do get an opportunity to be able to view it in that sense. However, I recognize that it's outside the purview of ourselves. So we are, from a governing standpoint, wanting to ensure that there's equity for our employees. And I would suggest that the fiasco that we went through as a board of the very unfortunate times was probably as a result because we didn't have strong policies and places where employees could go. So I think that, as we move towards ensuring equity for all, that we want to make sure that on a governance standpoint, that there is a policy that ensures that there is an opportunity for employees to be able to also be heard. And I recognize this is part of our strategy. Nora, you're working, Director Marsh, you've been working on that since your appointment. But I recognize where the purview falls, Patrick, but I did recognize its absence and look forward to it, not in the sense of approving it, just in being able to make sure that it dovetails with a broader policy and a broader strategy to ensure that human rights is also foundational for employment as well. So, and I know I'm speaking to the converted. So, but that was my only comment that I waited all night to be able to say.
So through you, Chair Stone, I appreciate your comments, Trustee Barrett. So we are contemplating, obviously, a more robust procedure that would address complaints and resolution of complaints on the harassment and safe and respectful workplace, which will dovetail with the human rights policy as well. But we are contemplating that the workplace harassment policy itself would be amended to include safe and respectful, which would be something that would come back to you for approval of the policy portion of that. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, then I look forward to my input on that. So I was trying to get you out, Council Cotter. So thank you.
Thank you. And Director Marsh.
Thank you very much, Chair Stone. We very much appreciate trustees' time this evening. I just want to confirm that in terms of next steps, whether or not from governance, there is a sense that we're okay to go out and do some broader consultation at this time, and that feedback then would come forward to standing committee, or what the committee sees as the next steps in terms of this particular policy.
Thank you, Director Marsh. I was wondering that myself. Trustee Barrett.
Just a thought, since at work we call it yellow, so that means you talk out loud to think. So I was thinking that certainly on going forward, seeking feedback from the public for sure. But what I would really like the opportunity is two things. One is that I recognize there's a methodology by which that you are going to go out in the simplification piece, or that perhaps that tool might be something that you develop. I don't need to see that. I don't think we need to see that before you do that. But I think, to be fair, and I think that based upon the conversation that we've had, if it's in the consensus or the approval of this committee, I'd like that feedback to come back to this committee, so that if there's going to be debate, and I recognize this is live stream, but if there's going to be debate or conversation, that it would come back here. We'd kind of put boundaries, or let's say smooth it, and then take it to the standing committee. That would be my preference, but it's up to the entire committee, obviously.
Thank you, Trustee Barrett. Trustee Crawford.
Just to build on that, I agree. I think our policy says that public consultation is necessary. So by all means, you should go ahead with that and then bring us back something. Whether it's here or standing doesn't matter to me, as long as we're given lots of notice and time to read it, and maybe set aside the whole meeting for it.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. Director Marsh.
Thanks. So just to confirm, then we'll happily go out and consult on the draft policy. And we had anticipated probably looking at about 2 months in terms of further consultation on this, given the importance and complexity of the policy, and also understanding that we'll have some corresponding pieces around that consultation. In the meantime, I'm wondering, Council Cotter, are there other pieces because there is multiple layers to all of this, and feedback in terms of the volume? The policy itself is 11 pages, but of course there was a lot of supporting documents that came forward. There are other procedures to come forward in terms of support of the policy. So Council Cotter, I'm just wondering, in terms of us all being on the same page of next steps, do you mind just outlining then when you would imagine the next engagement of governance would be on this, and then make sure that that's agreeable to the committee?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, we've typically been meeting monthly, so subject to a direction from the committee, I would imagine we would meet again in 3 or 4 weeks' time. But I think in terms of the consultation, I think we would be looking to go to the community with the package, which would include the other two procedures that we talked about. So I guess we're in the committee's hands as to whether we don't start until we come back to the governance committee with those two procedures, or whether the committee's content that we include those draft as part of the consultation now. So I think we'd be looking for your direction on that point as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Cotter. Trustee Morton.
I took my hand down because I was simply going to say that I endorse the idea of further public consultation, but I also feel strongly that that feedback needs to come back to us as soon as possible. And I think Trustee Crawford indicated that, as did Trustee Barrett. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Morton. Trustee Barrett.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm a little uncomfortable going forward for public consultation without at least having the opportunity to at least examine the two drafts. So I would prefer that the two drafts that you speak of, Patrick, actually come back to us as a committee. But I believe that we could plan that so it wouldn't necessarily interrupt your desire to be able to get out to the public. But I would feel uncomfortable having something as a draft that I haven't at least stuck my nose into, for better or for worse. So Yeah, and I had a question about one of the slides, if we're going to use it. So I'll finish this conversation and then come back to that. So
thank you, Trustee Barrett. Thank you, Trustee Barrett. Trustee Morton, did you have your hand up again? Okay. So trustees, is there anyone who is opposed to the two drafts coming back to committee? And when did you say, Council Cotter, that would be?
Well, I mean, those will be ready for the next governance meeting. So
Okay.
hopefully at the will of the committee, we could get that done in November, which would allow as it sounds like the committee wants to start the consultation once the full package is together. So I think ideally we have the next meeting in November. We'll have those procedures to you in advance of that meeting, and then we could go out with the whole package in November.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Trustee Barnes.
I just wanted to inquire, as we've had this on our agenda and we've had it discussed a couple of times, and community is probably having an eye out for this particular policy. Could there be a possibility of the draft being somewhere on our website that is accessible so our community can start taking a look at it while we get ready to go through the process of the consultation, but just to sort of update the community? I mean, this is live stream and it's public, so it's already out there, but something that is accessible to our community to see where we are in regards to this policy.
Yeah, thank you, Trustee Barnes. Is that a possibility, Director Marsh?
We're a little bit hesitant to put the policy out in the absence of the corresponding procedures, because otherwise people may start generating a lot of feedback of items that are covered in procedure, not understanding the delineation between policy and procedure within the school board governance model. So I think not to hold things up unduly, Trustee Barnes, but I'd be concerned that we would then generate a whole level of conversation that's actually addressed through the procedures. Also understand the importance of you wanting to see the procedures before they go out in support of the human rights policy. So I think with the committee's indulgence, we'll need to come back to the next committee meeting with those procedures that support the policy and then move forward from there. So with any luck, calendars will be, we'll find some common time earlier rather than later in terms of the November meeting, if that will work.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Thank you, Trustee Barnes. So as I see that there's two more hands up, and I will come to you, but as I understand it, then the drafts will come back for the November meeting, and just after that, then the consultations will begin. Correct. Okay, thank you. Trustee Lundquist.
Thank you, Chair Stone. So I think the one thing I would I kind of agree with, I understand the rationale that Director Marsh is providing, and I support that. I also understand the concern expressed by Trustee Barnes, and I'm wondering if we can even just put an update on, in a public way, because however much we think people are very interested in these meetings, most people are not sitting here listening to us. But many people do visit the website, and it might just be sort of a good idea to let people know that this is moving forward in some way. And I get that we might not want to share the whole policy and we don't have the procedure yet. And I certainly agree that that will inform people's views of the policy once they can see those, including our own. But in the interim, is there something we can do just so people know that this is, it's important and that it's moving forward?
Definitely. It's a great suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. Trustee Crawford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to suggest, it sounds like we're not going to do any public consultation until this comes back to us in another draft form. But maybe we can do it quicker rather than saying the next meeting or the next scheduled meeting. When it's ready, possibly we could have a special meeting on this only. And that way we could have it sooner, possibly, and we could concentrate on it. This document is sort of interfering with what we started out doing a year or so ago, and it will keep. But the sooner it's back to us, the better, even if it's in the form of a special meeting.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. Director Marsh.
Thanks. And just to make sure we're all sort of on the same page, we didn't really hear any direction in terms of specific amendments this evening that were passed by trustees. So the drafts we're talking about are actually procedures related to the areas that Trustee Barrett had raised around the workplace side of things. So it will be additional documents, not revisions of what we've shared this evening.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Are trustees wanting a special meeting for this policy? Oh, Trustee Barrett.
Well, I'm going to answer your question first then. So before I ask my other question is, I mean, I don't have a problem in being, if you can find time to be able to have another meeting prior to the governance meeting. I think we should leave that to staff. Once the policies are in draft form and ready to go, then we can put out a request to Chair Stone, to try and get together, to Paul Crawford's point about having one item on the agenda, the review of the draft, so that we don't hold anything up. So I'm quite comfortable with that. So.
Okay, so I will leave it to staff then to pick a date that's comfortable for you to have a special meeting called for this committee. And then the next meeting then in November hopefully will be based on our bylaws and code of conduct. Trustee, I actually was going to cut this shorter than what I did. I didn't cut it short at all because the conversation I thought was good and well worth having, and the information that came forth was excellent. Thank you, staff, for doing that. And I see Trustee Barrett has his hand up again.
I like that how you say again. So I just wanted to make sure, just for clarification, I recognize that the presentation that was sent out, the PowerPoint presentation, was one that we have seen before. I'm just wondering if that will be used in public consultation or not. Because if there is, there's just a question I have with on it for seeking to understand.
Director Marsh.
Chair Stone, if I may. So the presentation that was the separate document that was shared for PD purposes was sent out not as part of the package.
Okay.
It was just to remind trustees of that evening, because really without all of the speaking notes, some of the slides could be not easy to understand, but it was just to remind individuals of that evening that we had in terms of the PD session. It is not part of the public package. Okay, no, that's good, because and I knew I did recognize Director Marsh. I did recognize it. I knew it wasn't brand new, but you've answered my question. If we're not using it, then any comments that I have to it are redundant and innocuous, so I won't even bother. So, in trying to clarify, we may have confused matters, so my apologies through you, Chair Stone, to the committee.
Thank you, Director Marsh. So, trustees, it's what time is it? It is 7:45. I know we've spent a lot of time on this. We could move into the revised draft bylaws. I just want to sort of gauge where trustees are at, if we should put this off again, if people are getting tired, if we need to move on to something else, move this on to another time. I need feedback from trustees. Thank you. Trustee Barrett.
I was going to suggest, since we have 15 minutes left, we would not do it justice. I was going to move a motion to adjourn and be able to then spend the full time on the bylaws, getting started and then stopping in 15 minutes. I didn't think it was worth it. That was my concept, Chair Stone.
Yeah, thank you, Trustee Barrett. Trustee Crawford.
No, I agree with Trustee Barrett. We could spend 15 or 20 minutes on the code, actually, because we said in the minutes that we would look at the code on this date, the 25th, although I thought that we had agreed to work with the code separate from the bylaws because they're so large, but we can't do much with 15 or 20 minutes with those documents.
Right. Thank you, Trustee Crawford. I'm in agreement. Are there any trustees who are not in agreement with adjourning? Trustee Morton, you're muted.
I was also going to suggest that we wait and do the draft bylaws and the draft code of conduct at the next meeting. Those two items might take us another hour and a half.
Right. Thank you, Trustee Morton. Well, I know that we have gone through a lot of the bylaws. I think we hit on all of them last time. I trust that trustees will go through the documents prior to the next meeting, and I'm hoping that actually it won't take an hour and a half to go through it. I know prior to me joining, I think you've gone through a lot of the code of conduct as well. So trustees, again, if there's small revisions, send them ahead of time so that Patrick can work on them, and anything a little bit larger bring to the meeting. But hopefully those two together, if we work on them together, it shouldn't take that long. We have gone through this several times. So, but bring your concerns, and I will. Does any trustees have any other comments? Trustee Barrett, did I see your hand up? Okay, thank you. So I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you. Thank you, trustees. Thank you, staff.
Good night. Thank you, staff.
Good night.